Hello and welcome to My Ears Hurt, the podcast that explores the world of experimentation in music. I'm Daniel Marks,
I'm Nathan Rubin.
and on this, the show's inaugural episode, we're going to be talking about our personal taste in music, as well as the idea of experimenting with new kinds of instrumentation. But before we get into it, I kind of want to talk about what counts as experimental.
Yeah.
So Nathan, what would you suggest counts
Well, I
as experimental?
think experimental is kind of a hard topic because you don't want to give it a definition because then it doesn't become experimental. You know what I mean? The
Yeah,
whole point is that it should be something different and something unheard of. And once you define that as, oh, you have to do this, you're already boxing something that you want to unbox.
yeah. I mean, I guess for me, it's sort of trying to do something new with at least one aspect of the music you're creating. I
Mm.
don't think it necessarily has to be like overt. It doesn't have to be super obvious and in your face. For me, it sort of can and kind of often should be subtle.
Yes, yes. I think there's
Um,
an element of containing it because if you do too much, we've heard our fair share of music where everything is crazy. And when you get to that point, then it borders on, is this music or is this sound?
yeah,
Do people actually enjoy this?
it could just become self-indulgent.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't need to be completely inaccessible.
Mm.
So, yeah, I guess to kind of have an introduction to ourselves, who we are, and what we listen to, I guess is probably something we should go over because like
Sure.
who are we to press our opinions on the world if nobody knows who we are?
Mm.
So, Nathan, who are you?
Right, well, I'm a guy called Nathan Rubin, so I guess I'm formerly a guitarist and mainly these days sort of a composer. I've been playing the guitar, I guess it's 8 years now, and composing for about 5 of those. I've had my fair share of experience on other instruments, but when I was younger, I always wanted to sort of pick up, rock out on the electric guitar. And, I had my fair share of days doing that,
Yeah,
don't get me wrong, but guess a kind of natural evolution as I learned more about, theoretical music and, bringing the sort of intelligence, not to say music's not intelligent, but bringing the sort of, classical approaches to the genre of rock, led to me becoming more informed of, different ways of doing things. And that grew to me composing music and listening to a more variety of, experimental music that had this layer of intelligence that I couldn't necessarily find in more mainstream rock music.
so what would you say are your greatest musical influences?
Greatest musical influences, I mean, definitely number one, as you'll hear later, is Fredrik Thordendal, the lead guitarist, from Sugar. So they're sort of, an experimental metal band, been going for 25 years now. And to me, everything he puts out is almost perfect. I love it. It's great. It's everything I strive to be and everything I listen to. So I'd say he's sort of my main one. And next to that is another band called, it's funny enough, the Tony Danza Tap Dance
I
Extravaganza.
love that. I love that so
Everybody
much.
loves that name. It's such a great name. And again, the main guitarist, Josh Travis, he's using the 8 string like Frederick. And the way they sort of just push the limits of what can be done on a guitar and what can be done, with music and with songs and with albums, creating a piece of music, 50 minutes long that really lets itself, expand upon all these different themes, with the guitar and, really catches my attention.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So I should introduce myself.
Mm.
I'm Daniel. I come from I guess a background of jazz. I'm a saxophonist to some extent. But I've been ever since I was very small listening to jazz, whether or not that is by my own choice. A lot of it was just being subjected to my dad's taste in avant-garde jazz on car journeys and such. But because of that, I guess that's kind of my musical home. I return to jazz an awful lot, but I do try and listen to as wide a variety of music as possible, genre-wise, I guess, including things like hip-hop and progressive rock and electronic music and all sorts of different things. The other genre that I'm really into is sort of new kinds of folk music, whether that's like progressive bluegrass or like neo-folk and crossover and fusion and that kind of thing. I write about music. That's my thing. Nathan writes the stuff. I then press my opinion about it to the world, whether they appreciate that or not.
I write about it, or I write it, you write about it.
Yeah. I have a blog called Healthy Music Obsession where I write album reviews, so I listen to a lot of new music and stuff that's coming out now. I guess my main influences would be... So my main influence is a saxophonist called Michael Brecker, a tenor sax player who wasn't necessarily innovative, but definitely one of the best saxophonists who ever lived. He did play around with electronic instruments. He did a lot with the iwi, which is the electronic wind instrument, which is sort of it's like a MIDI saxophone, I guess. Which is something that I've always wanted to try, but they're very, very expensive, and I'm broke. So, yeah.
That's us.
Yeah, that's us.
A brief description of us.
Yeah. So, if that's something you find interesting, you can always look us up further. But for now, I think we're just going to get right into it.
Yeah.
We're going to start by introducing to you one of the pieces of music for us that have been formative in our listening careers, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
So, Nathan, what is your pick?
So, my first pick will be an extract from Fredrik Thordendal's Special Defects 1, Soul Niger Within. So, most of my friends will know, including Daniel, I don't think obsession is a strong enough word for this.
Yeah.
It was originally released in 1997. It's, a 45-50 minute long piece of music, split up into many different tracks. And it's really Fredrik just, showing what he can do with the 7-string guitar and showing his way of adapting and changing rhythm, with his theme of polyrhythms. That's a really big aspect of the music I listen to and his music, and using his jazz influence, from musicians like Alan Holdsworth. So putting that element of jazz melody and jazz fusion in metal music, all in 1997, this had never been done before at this point. And I think it's just an incredible piece of music for its time, and it still is better than most things now, in my opinion.
I'm glad you added that last part.
Yeah, I thought I had
to. we strive not to make sweeping objective statements.
No, of course podcast.
Not. So yeah, let's give this a listen. Oh, and actually, before we go on, let's just make a quick disclaimer. My Ears Hurt does not own any of the music that you will hear in this podcast. We're playing only short 20-second clips from each song, just for legal reasons. We're not monetizing this podcast, so please don't come after us. Thanks. So without further ado, here is Soul Niger Within.
So I guess now your ears probably do hurt after hearing that. But believe me, for me, it was a natural progression of hearing it and thinking, wow, that sounds odd. So, wow, that sounds interesting. Then 10 listens later, this is basically the only thing I listen to. So it does grow on you. But I do understand what it's like to hear it for the first time and be not scared of it, but it's not conventional.
It is an intimidating listen, especially when you're not sort of actively analysing it and figuring out what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that, it is grounded in the genre of metal and jazz fusion, but I think, it's its own entity. So I kind of want to talk about why I think it's experimental, why it is experimental. And I think the best place to start with this is rhythm. Fredrik Thordendal is known, in his community to be a rhythmic god as such. And I think it does show that to be true. Just how naturally it sort of enhances the idea of the polyrhythm and how it incorporates it brought so much interest in me, and it led to me doing that in my music too. And the way it works is you have a 4/4 pulse throughout, and if you know how that works, you'll be able to hear that quite clearly. And it's on the drum cymbals, they're hitting most of the time 4/4 beats. And the main rhythm in the guitar, the bass and the bass drum, however, is all tripleted. So while this creates sort of a polyrhythmic, rhythm going on, which is a 3/4 rhythm, you also have patterns in the guitar. So those might be patterns consisting, of 7 tripleted quavers or 8 or 9 or changing throughout. So this doesn't just incorporate a smooth running polyrhythm, but it includes gaps in it. And these gaps would conventionally be notated with time signatures because it's an element of phrasing. But this phrasing is not able to be put into time signatures over 4, 8, 16 or 32 like we normally have, because it's tripleted. And, if you do the maths, it doesn't quite fit into that. So what this needs is time signatures over different denominators, such as, 4, 6, 12, 24, and so on, which is, again, multiples of 6, 3, 2, 4, all of that. So it kind of brings the element of maths and experimentation into rhythm and, blows out conventional time signatures, which I think is great.
I found it to be almost minimalist in style, in the way that just sort of it's very layered and the changes are subtle, so that you don't necessarily notice things changing until it's happened, and it suddenly feels very, very drastic.
I think that's true, and I think the instrumentation is a big part. There are some incredible musicians, on this record. So we've got one of the drummers on it is Morgan Agren. I talk about him a lot. He's incredible at drums. He's Swedish, like Fredrik, and him and his counterpart on keyboard, Mats Öberg, who's actually blind. He's an incredible musician, and they work together. The 3 of them work together as well, and they've played with musicians like Frank Zappa. They're important figures in the Swedish jazz community, I'd say, and their musicianship, is on another level, and the way they work together, I think, just to create this, they all have their input and their own styles, which really formed this album.
You mentioned jazz and that community where a lot of these musicians are from. I really liked the harmonic devices used in this piece, particularly the extended chords and the dissonance. I hate to be cheesy and awful and punny, but it really did strike a chord with me. It was it's one of those things where, like, even if it's somewhat inaccessible because of the phrasing and the and I guess the vocals for me are something that I struggle with, just because they're quite harsh and
I'll get onto that.
but there's always something that you can find that would bring you back into your comfort zone, even if it's only for a short time.
Well, exactly. Well, I think Fredrik on guitar doing a few solos and Mats on the keyboard, the harmonics of approach they take to this is very jazz influenced, and as I said, and I think you'd be very comfortable with that, because the way they sort of explore the harmony that is set up, because it's very sort of based on the tonic. It doesn't modulate very much. I'm sure there's definitely a word for it that I've happened to have forgotten, but it's stagnant in its harmonic approach at first, and then that allows the lead musicians to expand on it with their solos and with their lead lines to really create some interesting, as you said, chords and patterns to be heard. You did also mention the harsh vocals.
Yes.
Now, these vocals are done by the man himself, Fredrik, and he, for Meshuggah, does not do any of the vocals, but for this side project, he did. And he obviously doesn't speak great English, being Swedish, so I think that one adds to... It makes it hard to understand in the first place, and his lyrical style, I don't know what you'd call it, but it is very, and that's what puts people off, if I'm honest.
I mean, like, for me, metal has been one of the genres that I have found it hard to break into, but I do find that in this case, sort of this screeching is quite atmospheric, and it does suit the piece.
It's like I said, at first I didn't really get it, but as in it grows on you, and then you understand it. It is you do have a sort of moment of clarity, but you have to get to that point. And the way that got me thinking about that is the same thing as sort of listening to sort of MIDI songs. Is that, yes, the sounds may not be great, but it's there. And the fact that it's there means it's representing something. You know, it's better to have something that may not be great than not have anything. Not to say Fredrik's lyrics are not great, you know, they're incredible. Yeah. But do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you mean. I guess we'll be coming back more to MIDI a bit later with your other pick for today. But I think let's move on to some acoustic sounds.
Sure.
So the song that I've brought to this episode as being one that's been formative for me is a piece called Attaboy from a project called the Goat Rodeo Sessions. The Goat Rodeo Sessions is a collaborative album between 4 musicians. Yo-Yo Ma, who is a very well-known classical cellist, Edgar Meyer, who is a classically trained double bass player, but who has a lot of experience in the world of folk music, Stewart Duncan, who is a very talented fiddle player, and then Chris Thile, who is a mandolin player and the front man of one of my favorite bands, Punch Brothers. This is a piece that it drew me into the world of progressive bluegrass and neo folk. It was the sort of first piece in that kind of style that I ever heard. But I talk about this piece on this podcast because of the instrumentation. It is quite experimental in that regard. This isn't your average string quartet. It's
stuck for words.
Just a little bit.
It's good. I've heard it. It's good.
But the album's called the Goat Rodeo Sessions because the word goat rodeo, it's an aviational term. It's used in that kind of field for the kind of situation where lots of things need to go exactly right in order to prevent a complete disaster. And that's how they thought of this instrumentation, I guess, and also sort of the bringing together of young musicians like Chris Thile and older, more experienced musicians like the other 3. But yeah, it's sort of the project marries together elements of progressive bluegrass and neo folk, but also more classical styles that people like Yo-Yo Ma would be more comfortable with. And I really love that sort of combination of old and new. That's a theme that I find really endearing in music. And particularly, we'll get into that later, but yeah. So without further ado, here is Attaboy from the Goat Rodeo Sessions. So, for me, one of the most endearing things about this piece of music is its use of style changes. In the clip that we've put into this episode, it captures the first one in the piece where the style changes drastically from something that is more classically oriented into something that is almost like an Irish reel. And I really feel that kind of change allows the musicians to demonstrate their flexibility as performers, but also the flexibility of the instruments and what they can do. The piece was described by, I think, Stewart Duncan in an interview as a jig in a snowstorm, that there's sort of like a set path that they're trying to follow, but sort of the conditions that they're under means that things are changing all the time and they're having to adapt to it. And I find that fascinating, but also it's just a really pretty piece of music, just on an aesthetic level, something that I really enjoy listening to. I mean, I don't know what you thought about it when you heard it. I think you heard it for the first time today, so.
Yes. Well, obviously, it wouldn't be my first choice. But there is something about watching them that I think brings it on another level. Now, I know I'm not a fan of judging music through visual clues, but watching them perform and interact brought another level of understanding to the piece, for me.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I find often in experimental music, that it's a lot easier to understand when you can see it being performed. I went to a gig a while back, which was a free improvised jazz performance by a guy called Evan Parker. And this is not music that I would personally listen to by myself, because it's very hard on the ears, and there's almost no structure and no recognizable sort of melodies or anything, because it's completely improvised. But watching it is so fascinating. But it's definitely not something that I would just listen to.
Yeah. And you said you didn't think, this, when they make this music, they don't try and box themselves in any sort of genre.
Yeah.
They try and leave it as open as possible with all the changes.
Yeah, I feel like one of the reasons that this is such a formative piece for me is because of that idea of fusion. I find that when musicians try and piece together elements of different genres and try and come up with something new, often those are the sounds that I find the most interesting in music. All right, so if we're to move on to our main topic for today, which is the idea of experimenting with instrumentation. And I would suggest that this could range from anything to, like a rock band that doesn't use guitars, like in, Radiohead's formative album Kid A, where they just completely abandon the idea of like a guitar rock band in favor of all sorts of different things, to like completely new instruments altogether, like, well, I guess like the instrument that you're going to tell us about in your pick.
Yes. So I think for my one, it's almost more fun if we just play it without saying anything. Can we do that? Can we rock the boat on the first episode?
That sounds like a plan. All right, so let's. I guess the piece is called "Toward the Continuum,"
by Dolores Catherino.
Yes. So here it is.
So what you heard there was actually a very interesting piece of music, and that was the first 20 seconds or so of it. Now, this piece of music is entirely MIDI, and if you haven't already picked up on, you will know very soon I love MIDI. And that's how I originally came across this, was by, clicking links on YouTube and sort of exploring the world of MIDI music. And what really caught my eye about this, is if you couldn't hear, is the microtonality of it. So the instrument used in this is the tonal plexus by H-Pi Instruments. And what this is it's a more sort of futuristic take on the keyboard. And the way it works is it's set out like a conventional keyboard, but it doesn't just have buttons horizontally, it has a set of buttons vertically. And these vertical buttons allow you to expand on the pitch, to a sort of degree and scale set by a computer, and it allows you to achieve pitches that are not able to be heard and not able to be recreated on acoustic instruments and in Western music. And this piece, I believe, is 106 EOT, which is an equal temperament tuning, so each note is the same length apart from each other, and I think there's 106 notes per standard octave, of which conventionally we only have 12.
Oh, that's nuts.
It's crazy, and it gets to the point where you think, can I actually hear a difference between these? And the answer is most likely no, now. But the more you listen to it and the more you hear the interaction between each notes, you're not necessarily hearing the sound of it, but you're hearing the vibrations, and that is when you can hear the dissonance and you can hear the harmonic relationships. And when, she lets the chords ring out on the machine, you can really hear, you can hear the wavering, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I found that those extended chords that she was playing were so much more just full and gorgeous with the microtones.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily something that you would expect, like the looking at the instrument as it is, with all of those different options for different frequencies, it doesn't sound nearly as dissonant as you would expect.
Yeah.
Like, you can definitely tell it's there if you're paying attention, but it doesn't sound as off as one would expect.
Yes, and I think you could create some major dissonance, and if I had my hands on this, the world would have a new definition for dissonance. But I think the way it does work, and I've used, computer programs they've offer products to sort of virtually use this instrument, and the way I went about making music with it is it's using conventional harmony, but just adding a little more bit of, vibration to each note to make it a bit more wobbly and add just, that divergence in pitch.
I definitely feel like with an instrument like this, less is definitely more.
Yeah.
But I did find watching the video of Dolores playing it, the construction of the instrument itself is really, really impressive.
Yeah.
And that you've got all these different buttons everywhere, and it's very difficult to sort of keep track of what's what, I guess.
Yeah.
So it must take a huge amount of discipline to be able to master it and play it like she does.
I think it did, and can I have permission to go on a little rant here about how she did this? Because I did my research.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
And the way she learned to play the instrument and the way she has learned to notate music for this instrument, and that's incredible, notating instrument for, notating music for an instrument with 106 notes. She had to do it, I think she had to do it in a conventional way. And her sheet music, and you can see it on her instrument, is like normals. So it's normal sheet music, but each note has a colour.
Right.
And that colour represents how sharp or how flat the pitch is. And she has little sticky bits on each note on the keyboard with different colours. So you can notate it, and then so that's very clever, and it allows it definitely allows you to notate the music. But I have a big problem with this.
Why?
And the problem is that you still notate music in a standard way, consisting of notes of C, D, E, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And you're still, even though each different pitch has a different color and therefore a different sound, you are still basing your composition on 12 notes, which is limiting you.
So now, your thought process here is this should be a complete revelation, a completely new thing, rather than just doing something a little bit more interesting with standard Western harmony.
Yes, I think a more clever way of doing this, or in my eyes, I see it more as a development of a system like tablature, which is based on numerical ways which are non-biased towards notes. Because if you have C pink or C blue, it's still instinctively in your head a C. Whereas if you have 6 or 7, they're not far apart, but 6 or 7 to me is a bigger difference and allows you not to be biased towards sticking to a 12-note system.
So for those of you who don't know, and I assume that's most of you, Nathan's going to be starting a degree in maths and music in September.
Yes. Hopefully we'll enjoy it very much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suspect that it's in some point in the future, Nathan will be imposing on the world his brand new system for notating music entirely with numbers.
Yes. Well, that's what I work towards, and I'm already almost there because all my music is numerical, and I think it is just the best way in my eyes, the most organic and the best way to connect with the computer on what is happening musically and how to be accurate.
It's certainly efficient, and definitely something to consider. I mean, I found this piece to be really, really interesting.
It sounds great. It sounds really good.
Purely on an aesthetic level, it's very, very ethereal and very mysterious, and I love how full the chords sound. Like even with the sort of very artificial MIDI sound of it, it is quite pleasing on the ear.
Yeah.
Right. So the song that I've brought to the table is a song called Blop, and it's by a jazz trio from the UK called the Elliot Galvin Trio, who are signed to a record label called Edition Records, which is probably a group that I will be talking about a lot on this podcast, because they are probably the people who are most pioneering in the jazz world, particularly in Britain and in Scandinavia. They are the most innovative group of musicians in that area at the moment. And as with Toward the Continuum, I think we'll let the music do the talking and then spew our opinions on it afterwards. So here is Blop by the Elliot Galvin Trio. So that was Blop. Now, you may be thinking, what was that I just heard? What was that instrument I just heard? That is a setup of Elliot Galvin's own design. So Elliot Galvin is a keyboard player who likes to play around with different keyboard instruments. This particular setup was also microtonal, like in the previous piece. It's a microtonal melodica.
That's great.
Now, the way that this works is not nearly as complicated and innovative, I guess, but it's still a lot of fun, I think. He's taken two melodicas that are tuned very slightly apart, so that if you were to play a C on one melodica and a C on the other one, you'd get dissonance. And he's playing sort of melodies and chords across both of the instruments simultaneously to create a much more dissonant sound, which I absolutely love.
It's great.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of getting across these sort of dissonant avant-garde jazz melodic and harmonic ideas.
Yeah.
But I love that in sort of, particularly in the clip that we just played, the way that the tune is structured. You've got this sort of opening dissonant chordal part, and then quick melodic breaks in the middle, which sound improvised but aren't. Like, they're very quick, and there's sort of scalic runs and all sorts of different patterns, which you would expect to be in an improvised solo, but then he repeats them exactly as he played them before later in the piece, which I find really impressive, particularly on instruments that are sort of as awkward to navigate as a melodica, particularly with the breath control and that kind of thing, which is just something that I think is really impressive. But the one thing that really I find striking about this piece is the way that it makes dissonance playful. It makes it fun and kind of like cheeky and impish, which I guess fits in with the concept of the album that this is from. It's based around Punch and Judy, which is for those of you for those of you who don't know, Punch and Judy is like a British seaside institution. It's a puppet show for children that's presented in quite a funny way, but actually really sinister. It's literally a puppet show for kids about domestic abuse, and so it's sort of like the music here is doing the same thing. It's presenting sort of like really sort of violent and uncomfortable musical ideas in a really fun and sort of kiddie way. Really, really bizarre, but a lot of fun.
I think it's great, and I did really like one of the parts in the song when it's a midsection and he's playing these sort of hammering chords, and the microtonal dissonance, to compare it to a noise, makes it sound like sort of a freight train coming along, but really you can just hear the differences in the chords, and the more you listen to it, the more you sort of understand what's actually being played, and you can develop a knowledge for each chord and each microtonal note. And I really like that, how even in this sort of setup of two slightly different tuned melodicas, he creates his sort of own sound, and it's really good.
I find it quite funny that the band itself, if you take away Elliot Galvin as a person, it's just like a normal jazz trio. Like the drummer and the bassist aren't doing anything particularly bizarre or exciting. But then you just plonk this sort of nutter of a pianist in front of them, and it turns it into something completely different, completely nuts.
Yeah.
It just I find that quite amusing. So yeah, I mean, I think that was fun. That was a good set of 4 pieces for you guys to sink your teeth into. The links to where you can listen to and or purchase the full songs legally are in the show notes. So if your curiosity has been piqued, please feel free to explore that interest.
Well, thank you very much for listening to My Ears Hurt. So if you enjoyed it, please do follow us, like, subscribe, all the usual, and comment, any questions or suggestions. Also, feel free to comment any topics you want us to discuss, like we've been doing today. Today's topic was microtonal instruments. So if you've got anything you'd like to hear us talk about, please do suggest it. So you can find Daniel on Twitter at alwaysbewhelmed, and you can also find his blog at healthymusicobsessions.com. And you can find me on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Nathan-Ruben-4. So thank you very much. Have a good day.